American Spirits, episode 16, where we will be finishing our reading and review of Charles Beard's An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. This is part 2. This will probably be a little bit of a shorter one. Ryan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very good. How are you doing?
Good. Got a little snow on the ground again, so that's nice. And then Mr. Quinn, how are you?
Indeed, fall falls anon, and I am digging the autumnal vibes.
So, yes, as I said, yesterday we learned about how Microsoft is remaking Halo Combat Evolved. Today we're going to learn about how the national government was remade with the Constitution.
And how the two are connected.
Yes, and okay. So yeah, this will probably be a bit of a shorter one. The second half of the book is somewhat redundant with the first, although there's a few interesting things we can pick up on. And actually, while we're right at the beginning here, I'll mention you can super chat on Entropy as usual, and on YouTube as well. Entropy definitely preferred, so that link is up for all the streams. And at the beginning, why don't we just go ahead and announce what we're doing for the next stream? We've hyped it up a bit. The next stream is The Betrayal of the American Right by Murray Rothbard. We're just going to do 1 week on that. We've got Pete Quinones, and who do we have, Ryan?
If all goes well, we'll also be joined by Tom Woods, a very famous libertarian commentator, right-winger to the very end. So that's very exciting, I think.
Yes.
Who may have contributed something to the work under discussion, I believe.
Yes.
Yes, right. He in the modern printing, at least, he wrote an excellent foreword on the book. So that'll be good. He's an expert in this topic.
Yes, so I'm very excited for that. That's going to be a really cool stream. So why don't we go ahead and get into this book? So let's see what the first selection I had is. Let's see, switch to our viewing room here, and then load up page 217.
Pro streamer tip, always narrate what you're doing in OBS to the audience.
Yeah, it's important to fill up that dead air. So here's yes. So first thing we have set up is sort of about the departure of process from the way the Constitution was brought in. Ironically, I actually saw this brought up just yesterday in a debate, and it is interesting because when you get into the history of this, you'll find that leftists tend to argue pro-Constitution and claim it is a legitimate, completely democratic, there was nothing shady about it type process, and it really represented the will of the whole of the people, kind of like, Beard describes the pro-constitutional side, at this time what's called the Federalist side, even though that's a misnomer. That's their argument as well. And as we've seen, whatever you think of the Constitution, that's definitely not true. I think that's been resoundingly demonstrated by Beard, and we'll get into some more of that on this stream. The Constitution absolutely was not a representation of the whole people, strictly in a democratic sense. Does anyone want to
Indeed,
comment
and
on
for
that before I read?
the audience's background, the Articles of Confederation had a process for amending the Articles of Confederation. Congress would propose amendments, and then they would have to be unanimously adopted by the state legislatures, which will become important later on. So that's the way it was theoretically supposed to be done under the Articles. If you wanted to change something about the fundamental law of the country, there was a procedure for that, which we talked about last week, and which we'll talk in more detail this week, was not followed.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like today, we have a process for amending the Constitution as defined by the Constitution. It's one thing to say do that. That would be quite controversial. It would be another thing to sort of call for a complete replacement of the Constitution as a form of government. Anyway, let me read the quote here for page 217. Quote, This whole process was a departure from the provisions of the then fundamental law of the land, the Articles of Confederation, which provided that all alterations and amendments should be made by Congress and receive the approval of the legislature of every state. If today the Congress of the United States should call a national convention to, quote, revise the Constitution, and such a convention should throw away the existing instrument of government entirely and submit a new frame of government to a particular referendum, disregarding altogether the process of amendment now provided, we should have something analogous to the great political transformation of 1787 to 89. The revolutionary nature of the work of the Philadelphia Convention is correctly characterized by Professor John W. Burgess when he states that had such acts been performed by Julius or Napoleon, they would have been pronounced coup d'etat, end quote. So, yeah, the thing is here, if you're going to hold the Constitution as this sort of sacred document, then you really ought to hold the Articles of Confederation in just as sacred a capacity, which is totally contradicted in the way they were overridden. And in reality, the Constitution ought to be as easily done away with the Articles of Confederation. So there are really no legs to stand on when it comes to the what we would call conservative, sacred view of the Constitution, as if it weren't simply brought in a way that effectively is a literal coup d'etat, and as if by its own standards simply overthrowing it in a similar means would in any way be unjustified or even wrong. So that's a key point
It also
here.
right, and it also sort of blows open this whole idea that the Constitution is the natural or necessary form of government for the people of the United States, the Americans. Considering that if it was a coup d'état that brought it in, it could have just as well have been anything else. This was not just a natural development necessarily.
No, it was very much a forced development, as we've come to understand by certain economic interests, or you might say class interests, as Beard defines them. And there was no reason that things had to go this way. It was the result of, let's say, 10 years of very precise and determined machinations by particular economic interests in order to bring this outcome about. Now, here I have a quote about why the particular method of ratification that was used was chosen, from page 221. Quote, a study of the opinions of the member of the convention shows that 4 leading reasons led to the agreement on ratification by state conventions. It permitted the disregard of the principle of unanimous approval by the states. A firmer foundation would have been laid for the Constitution if it had the sanction of special conventions rather than temporary legislatures. I'll pause there really quick to say that, just to reiterate that, the idea is that the Constitution, if approved by special conventions specifically selected by, quote, the people to do this, that would lend the Constitution more legitimacy than just whatever, basically random legislatures happened to be in the states at the time would have given the Constitution as far as legitimacy.
Of course, how a specially called convention has any greater temporal scope than a particular legislature is not clear.
Indeed. Continuing, quote, one of the first objects of the Constitution was to restrict the authority of state legislatures, and it could hardly be expected that they would voluntarily commit suicide. Yeah, take a look at the conservatives of today. Maybe we'll learn about this next week. Anyway, continuing. Another leading purpose of the convention was to pay the public debt at par, and the members had learned from the repeated appeals to the state legislatures for funds to meet this national obligation that no relief was to be expected from this source. There was a better chance of getting the right kind of citizens elected to a convention than to a legislature. By separating the election of delegates to state conventions from the election of members to the state legislatures, the supporters of the Constitution were better able to concentrate their campaign of education. As for the provision of the Articles of Confederation requiring the approval of every state for any amendment in the Articles, the urgent necessities of the advocates of the new system could not permit such a mere technicality to stand in their way, end quote. So the last half of that quote really is making the point that the special conventions basically serve the ends of the particular class interests behind the Constitution better. So the conventions are being used not in order to, simply provide the most just and fair and secure way to bring the Constitution into being, but it is the means by which the Constitution is simply most likely to be approved. It's not designed to debate the Constitution, it is designed to get it approved, right?
And it makes sense. A legislator has to think about his next term, whereas a delegate to a constitutional convention is a one-time thing who can do what he's there to do without worrying about seeking another term.
Exactly. Continuing immediately from there, quote, the question of their legal right to cast aside their instructions and draft a totally new instrument was more or less troublesome for those who entertained a strict regard for the observance of the outward signs of propriety. No doubt the instructions of the delegations from the several states limited them to revision of the Articles of Confederation, and it is highly improbable that in the state of public temper then prevailing a convention would have assembled at all if its revolutionary purposes had been understood. During the debates behind closed doors, Mr. Paterson declared that the delegates were bound by their instructions, but Randolph replied that, quote, he was not scrupulous on the point of power, end quote, and Hamilton agreed with this view, saying, we owed it to our country to do on this emergency whatever we should deem essential to its happiness. The states sent us here to provide for the exigencies of the Union, to rely on and propose any plan not adequate to these exigencies merely because it was not clearly within our powers would be to sacrifice the means to the end, end quote. So there we have Mr. Hamilton, of course, laying it out very clearly where the convention and Hamilton's faction, and Hamilton in person in particular, set out immediately on a revolutionary course that was not disclosed to the states intentionally, and then argued that, well, it's fine to do that because this is why the states sent us here, even though it was explicitly not why the states sent us here. It's our duty to do this, basically. Otherwise, we're,
Sovereign is he who decides what again?
Yes, the exception. The exception to literally the supreme law of the land is the sovereign authority, as we well know. All right, and then continuing just on the next page, continuing from there as well, reading a lot from this particular segment to lay out how this went. Quote, outside the halls of the convention, it also became necessary to defend this revolutionary departure from their instructions. Madison took up the cause in The Federalist and made out an unanswerable case for his side, frankly pleading the justification of revolution if the legal arguments which he advanced were deemed insufficient. At the outset, he is unwilling to admit that the convention had broken with its instructions and performed a revolutionary act. He, accordingly, puts forward a legal and moral justification first, based upon an analysis of the instructions of the delegates. They were bound, he shows, to make such revisions in the articles as would render them adequate to the exigencies of the Union, but an adequate government, he pleads, could not be made by revising the articles, and the convention was either compelled to sacrifice the greater for the less by strictly obeying its instructions, or to do its whole duty by sacrificing the letter of the law. Then he clinches the argument. I'll pause there briefly and just make the point that one of the major reasons that this convention is held is this issue of the repayment of debts, particularly the federal debts, right? And are we to take seriously Madison's argument that it would not, and or Hamilton's, that it would not be possible to come up with amendments through the legitimate process to deal with the settling of the national debt, giving the powers to Congress necessary that it lacked therein to tax potentially and settle these things? I think one could imagine that this could have been possible. I'll just interject.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly as well, because when we when we read through Merrill Jensen's books on the Confederation period, they specifically did find ways to at least stabilize the national debt. They came up with a plan in order to mitigate it quite substantially. What I think should be understood here is that the Federalists, as they will be known later in history, are more concerned that the Articles of Confederation system wouldn't allow them their specific solutions to fix it. This is all nice rhetoric. It's a means to get what they want. This isn't an absolute statement that this can't be fixed.
Indeed. So let me just finish Madison's quote there, which I have now flipped away from. Where is it here? Quote, so this is from the Federalist. Quote, let them declare whether it was of most importance to the happiness of the people of America that the Articles of Confederation should be disregarded and an adequate government be provided and the Union preserved, or that an adequate government should be omitted and the Articles of Confederation observed. So that's just Madison's own words in the Federalist Papers. And once again, following from there, now on page 223-24, quote, the opponents of the Constitution were able to see the significance of that clause of the Constitution which cast aside the legal system under which they were living and provided that new instrument should go into effect when ratified by 9 states, as between those states. End quote. I'll just pause there again. So the key point here is that once 9 states ratified the Constitution, then the Constitution would be the new government under those states. Effectively, they would be seceding from the Articles of Confederation, leaving the other states still under that government. So these governments would exist in parallel with one another, as some states left for the Constitution and others remained under a different union under the Articles of Confederation. So it's very similar to the type of secession that happened decades later in the 1860s.
Indeed, and this parallel coexistence of governments is exactly why sovereign citizens have their rights under the Articles of Confederation.
Sigh. Now, so that's really key because there's a power dynamic that happens, right? If 9 of the 13 states move under the constitutional government with a powerful national government, leaving 4 possibly not even geographically contiguous states under the Articles, or perhaps even fewer than 4, that would effectively leave them in a position to where they had no choice, right? And that point is actually made here. So I'll continue from these letters. Quote, Cornelius in Massachusetts explained great anxiety on this point, and in his letters on December 11th and 18th, 1787, he asked concerning this departure, quote, will not the adoption of this Constitution in the manner here prescribed be justly considered as a perfidious violation of that fundamental and solemn compact by which the United States hold an existence and claim to be a people? If a nation may so easily discharge itself from obligations to abide by its most solemn and fundamental compacts, may it not with still greater ease do the same in matters of less importance? And if nations may set the example, may not particular states, citizens, and subjects follow? End quote. We'll just pause there. I guess, yes, it does quite literally make the sovereign citizen point here, where why can't citizens just secede? Well, maybe they can. Continuing, quote, what then will become of public and private faith? Where is the ground of allegiance that is due to government? Are not the bonds of civil society dissolved? Or is allegiance founded only in power? Has moral obligation no place in civil government? In mutual compacts, can one party be bound while the other is free? Or can one party disannul such compact without the consent of the other? If so, constitutions and national compacts are, I conceive, of no avail. The oaths and allegiance must be preposterous things. End quote. So yeah, of course, the point being made there is simply that if the Constitution will effectively mean nothing if the Articles can simply be done away with and swapped out so easily, perhaps that point more or less has proven somewhat true now in our contemporary times, or even not that long after the fact. Now, moving forward a bit, I've brought up on the stream this one particular table that the author brings to the fore in the book, which is actually a table of popular votes in New York. So this table is looking at how a very small segment of the population, the small segment of the population who did in fact vote, how did they actually vote in New York? Now, of course, again, the Federalist side, which is a misnomer, is the pro-Constitution side. The anti-Federalist side on page 245 is the anti-Constitution side. So we can see here as the article, as I'll read the author's statements, quote, "Several conclusions are obvious from this table. Measured by the popular vote, New York was overwhelmingly against the ratification of the Constitution. With the apportionment of representation against them, the anti-Federalists elected nearly twice as many delegates as the Federalists. The popular vote in favor of ratification was largely confined to the urban centers of New York City and Albany City, thus correcting assumptions based on the convention vote alone." End quote. So what happens, of course, at the convention is that the anti-Federalist delegates basically switch sides at the convention and are persuaded, or perhaps always intended to vote this way, changed so that they were for the Constitution. And this is, of course, how it gets ratified. You'll find this pattern is common in several states, not all of them, as we'll get to, where in terms of how much a popular vote can even be said to happen with the property rights and other exclusions placed on voters. In many cases, a state who sends a majority anti-Federalist delegation actually ends up voting for the Constitution's ratification. And of course, keep in mind that it's not the only option on the table, right? There could be articles to the articles proposed. They could be amended. It is not the delegates were sent there to revise the Articles of Confederation. That's the purpose.
The anti-Federalist delegates grew in office.
Indeed. Now, I believe you wanted to bring up something from Virginia regarding this?
Yeah, so the book devotes a great deal of space to going state by state and listing out the factions and the geographic regions which were pro and anti-Constitution. And the pattern which emerges in most states is it's an east and west versus the middle kind of a pattern. The eastern seaboard regions, where the mercantile and commercial interests are concentrated and whose interests would be advanced by the ratification of the Constitution, are pro-Constitution. Likewise, the western sides of the states, where you have the frontiersmen worried about Indian attacks, as well as who also have important trading interests, because the frontier is where a lot of the trading happens. That's where they get the furs, that's where they get the wood for the lumber. So a lot of trading going on in the west. And so the western districts of the various states also tended to be very pro-Constitution, whilst the middles of each state, these being interior agrarian areas with poor roads, not a lot of trade going on, largely small farmers, these groups tended to be anti-constitutional. And this pattern holds up in 12 of the 13 states. The one anomaly there is Virginia. Virginia was divided into 4 general regions. First was the Tidewater. This is the coastal area where the great planters and the commercial interests are, and they are unsurprisingly pro-Constitution. The second area is the Piedmont. This is a more agricultural, small farmer area, which was reliably, as you would expect, anti-constitutional. But west of the Piedmont was the Shenandoah Valley. And the Shenandoah Valley, like the Piedmont, was mostly small farmers, albeit ethnically different ones, mostly Scotch, Irish, and German. And Beard just kind of hand waves this, saying, well, these people had different religious and historical traditions, so they were pro-Constitution, which the Shenandoah Valley was, precisely the opposite of what you would expect if we were doing a pure economic analysis here. And then finally, the fourth region was Kentucky, which at that point was still part of Virginia, and which was the frontier area, which in every other state, the pattern would be a pro-constitutional area, but in Virginia it wasn't. The Kentuckians were rabidly anti-constitutional. So in the end, it came out that Virginia ratified like the rest, but it was the one anomaly in the pattern that is laboriously traced through a couple hundred pages of the book.
Indeed, and we'll get to a few other breakdowns shortly. I saw Dawn Browning is now watching, which is good. She mentioned my mic is quiet. I am quite literally shouting into the microphone, and it's at max gain, and it's at no decibel offset. So it's just one of those things where people who don't stream have no idea how frustrating streaming can be, because it never ever works the same with the same hardware on a different platform. So I'm probably just gonna have to buy a new microphone and see if that helps. Maybe the gain button on my Yeti is like broken or something. That could be possible because it is quite old. So anyway, I will just continue.
And to help
shouting.
Charlie with a new microphone, send your super chats to the Old Glory Club on Entropy and YouTube.
Yeah, I see we only have one today from Christopher Burke, I think for $2, sending a salute as usual. But anyway, I will just keep shouting for now. And yes, so up here on screen we have from page 254, the author actually cites several other works in order to facilitate his point, which contain, quote, general truths concerning the conflict over the ratification of the Constitution in the several states have already been established by scholars like Libby, Harding, and Ambler. The first of these authors, Dr. Libby, has made a painstaking study of the geographical distribution of the vote of the Constitution, in which he sets forth the economic characteristics of the areas for and against the adoption of the Constitution. These conclusions are all utilized in this chapter, but they are supplemented by reference to the later researches of Harding and Ambler, and by a large amount of new illustrative materials here presented for the first time. The method followed is to exhibit, in general, the conflict of economic interest in each of the several states over the adoption of the Constitution. So that's just sort of a description of where his sources are coming from, and where he's getting the numbers from, and he's not just sort of pulling it out of nowhere.
And this is, once again, to underscore, this is pretty conclusive evidence that this is just at heart an economic document. I know that there's a lot to say against materialism and reducing things down to economics, but just reading this book is a good antidote to sort of the overcorrection that we've seen recently, that economics is secondary, or it can just come along after other things happen, or it'll just solve itself. This is a pretty good evidence that it's much more primary than perhaps it's been made out to be in recent years.
Definitely. It's quite clear that Hamilton was one of the few really politically motivated people, whereas everyone else was really, well, not everyone else, but many other delegates were economically motivated more than based on a particular political formula in of itself. So I've selected New Hampshire as a good example of one of the breakdowns. So, quote, New Hampshire. There were 3 rather sharply marked economic districts in New Hampshire which found political expression in the convention that ratified the Constitution. 2 of the 3 were the sea coast area and the interior or middle region. The former, says Libby, the coast area, represented the commercial and urban interests. Here were to be found most of the professional men, leaders of thought, men of wealth and influence. The second section, the interior, was composed of those representing the small farmers, a population cut off from the outside world by lack of good roads, and which raised little for market except to exchange for the few things that could not be produced at home. The former class, progressive and liberal, and familiar with the practical details of government, as a rule voted for the Constitution. The latter, conservative by environment and having little knowledge of what went on outside the narrow bounds of the home village or township, quite as generally voted against the Constitution. End quote. So this has been emphasized throughout the book, and also in Jensen's book, how the major divide, and we've even seen this in other places, is the coastal elites, the merchants in the cities on the coast, versus the interior, the farmers in the interior primarily. But also settlers and what you might call pioneers.
I do something that I can easily see becoming a talking point if anyone was to really take seriously what we're saying here, is that perhaps the people in the interior is that they were debtors, the people on the coast having a strong incentive to make sure all their money was paid back and whatnot, being the creditors. Someone might take from this that the people in the interior just shouldn't have been there. It was perhaps subsidized or whatever else, but it's worth keeping in mind the economic situation of the colonies before independence was strictly disincentivizing people to settle the West, making it more costly, preventing their settlement altogether, allying with the people that were trying to kill them, the tribes out on the West. Something that might be easy to take away from all this is that the people on the frontier shouldn't have been there due to economic concerns itself. But yeah, I think you can see that this is all very artificial. The people that benefited under the previous regime still have the resources and the prestige and the power under the new regime, and they are using that to wield their control and sort of bend the regime into their interests. It's a common pattern in history.
All right, and I've also got Massachusetts selected, and this very explicitly gives us the geographic breakdown here, and Beard is citing Libby. Quote, Massachusetts. The vote in Massachusetts on the Constitution was clearly along class or group lines. Those sections in which were to be found the commerce, money, and securities, in a word, personalty, were in favor of the ratification of the new instrument of government, and those sections which were predominantly rural and possessed little personalty were against it. Libby classifies the sections on the basis of the vote as follows. Eastern section, yeas 73%, nays 27%. Middle section, yeas 14%, nays 86%. Western section, yeas 42%, nays 58%. Speaking of this table, he says, such striking differences as these indicate clearly that there is something fundamental lying back of the vote. Each of these sections is an economic and social unit, the first representing the coast region, the second the interior, and the third the Connecticut Valley and border districts of the state. In the eastern section, the interests were commercial. There was the wealth, the influence, the urban population of the state. The middle section of Massachusetts represented the interior agricultural interests of the state, the small farmers. From this section came a large part of the Shays faction in 1786. The Connecticut Valley or Western District may be subdivided into the northernmost interior and predominantly anti-federal section and the southern section nearest the coast and predominantly federal, with the trading towns of the Connecticut River in its southeastern part. End quote. All right, and now I have tiny text on the screen. Let me check the book so I can get the context here. Okay, yeah, this is just the next page. So now Libby cites Harding on Massachusetts as well, one of the other scholars. Quote, Harding, after an independent study of the opposition to the Constitution in Massachusetts, come to substantially the same conclusion. Among the weighty elements in the struggle, he places the conflict of interest, partly real and partly fancies, between the agricultural and the commercial sections of the state. Underlying the whole opposition, he continues, was the pronounced antagonism between the aristocratic and the democratic elements of society in Massachusetts. Massachusetts was not alone in this experience. In most, if not all, of the states, a similar contest had arisen since the war. The men who at Philadelphia had put their names on the new Constitution were, it seems, quite safe to affirm, at the time identified with the aristocratic interest. There can be no question that this feeling of antagonism between democracy and aristocracy underlay most of the opposition in the Massachusetts Convention. Of course, this second element of opposition, aristocracy versus democracy, introduced by Harding, is really nothing but the first under another guise, for the aristocratic party was the party of wealth with its professional dependence, and the Democratic Party was the agrarian element which, by the nature of economic circumstances, could have been no large body of professional adherents. This economic foundation of the class division was fully understood by Adams and set forth with unmistakable clearness in his defense of the American Constitutions. Hamilton, Madison, and all thinkers among the Federalists understood it also. To speak of a democratic interest apart from its economic sources is therefore a work of supererogation, and it does not add, in fact, to an exposition of the real forces at work. Harding himself recognizes this and explains it in a luminous fashion in his introductory chapter. End quote. So the important point being made there is in when talking about early American history and perhaps like the Confederacy or something, not this Confederacy, but the one later in the 1860s, we talk about this aristocratic element. And the point that Beard is making here is that aristocratic element is a sort of misnomer for what can be described more clearly as the wealthy commercial and landowning classes. And that is what we're really talking about. It's not aristocracy versus democracy purely in a class antagonism way, but a different type of class antagonism based on economic interests.
Yeah, the democracy aristocracy dichotomy that gets set up is largely rhetorical. It's really much more concrete economic interests at play here.
Right, and this is the whole point that I think a lot of people latched on to, some of the earlier versions of elite theory that were passed around our spheres, is that it was much more granular and it was a much more grounded analysis of what these things are, whereas beforehand a lot of people, especially on the online right, were talking about these ethereal concepts, these ethereal
Indeed,
monoliths.
and when we talk concrete, we really mean concrete and material, in as much as many, many, many of the delegates actually owned a lot of public securities and private securities, which were directly affected by the ratification of the Constitution.
Yeah, and I mean, you might be referencing what I've pulled up here in relation to Boston in particular. I'll actually go to the previous page and cite the names. Quote, for example, Boston had 12 representatives in the state ratifying convention, all of whom voted in favor of the Constitution. Of these 12 men, the following were holders of public securities: Samuel Adams, James Bowdoin Sr., Tom Dawes Jr., Christopher Gore, John Coffin Jones, William Phillips, Thomas Russell, and John Winthrop. In other words, at least 8 out of the 12 men representing the chief financial center of the state were personally interested in the fate of the new Constitution. How deeply, it is impossible to say, for the ledgers seem to have disappeared from the Treasury Department, and only the index to the funded debt remains. Supplementary records show some of them to have been extensively engaged in dealing in paper. The 4 men who apparently were not security holders were John Hancock, Caleb Davis, Charles Jarvis, and Reverend Samuel Stillman. The town surrounding Boston... Yeah, go ahead.
Ledgers disappearing, security cameras malfunctioning. There's nothing new under the sun.
Indeed. I'm not going to read the whole list of names, but the towns surrounding Boston and Suffolk County also returned a number of men who were holders of securities, and then you've got a bunch of names on screen. In other words, 22 of the 34 men from Boston and Suffolk County who voted in favor of the ratification of the Constitution in the Massachusetts Convention were holders of public securities, and all of the 22, except for 2, Wales and Warren, probably benefited from the appreciation of the funds which resulted from the ratification, end quote. So something that Beard talks about a lot is that there's unbelievable amounts of documents that do in fact exist that would take ages for any scholar to go through in these particular cases, but we can see quite clearly that, as you were saying, Mr. Quinn, or Ryan as well, that this idea of aristocracy, or these elites, it's not a mere ethereal sort of theoretical phenomena. There are real material interests driving these people in this case, and they're acting individually toward their particular interest as individuals, which sort of culminate in a class interest. Their class in of itself is not this like pre-existing thing that has to impose itself simply by nature of existing as this sort of conceptual aristocracy. It's a very real thing, this class interest.
Just to break ever so slightly from history, I imagine you would find a very similar pattern, especially in the modern day, when we're looking at basically the sides of the new political spectrum. Like when I first became politically aware, it was branded under globalists versus nationalists. People kind of have an idea of what's being discussed, even now. when I bring that up. You could probably find similar interests at play here. This is not to say kind of like Beard tends to say when he's overstating his case that there's basically only material interests except for one person. I imagine there are some true believers in current politics, kind of like the Hamilton that we discussed in this book. I would love to know what the current financial interests are for either side to such granularity as this book has. Unfortunately, I imagine I'll have to wait a few decades to ever learn that.
Yes, interestingly though, the very specific financial transactions are much more likely to be preserved, and probably, despite their massively increased volume, can actually be parsed through, especially with the aid of a computer, what we call, AI. These things could probably help us have a much more complete understanding of what's happening than we can with these paper records that still exist in the Library of Congress but don't even exist in a digital form. And if they don't exist digitally at this time, they may as well not exist at all, right? So that's actually an interesting point you make, and is the proper way to think about the elite interest at play now, in terms of their money and particular interest as individuals, not as some sort of like mystical class or something like that. Now, what I have on screen here, I just wanted to select this because what this quote does is it acknowledges that at the time people were aware of these interests, and there's literature at the time which he cites. I'm not going to read it, but he cites in the book several pieces of pamphleteering at the time that actually point out these class interests that Beard is pointing out. Quote, "It is in the literature of the contest in the states where the battle over ratification was hottest that we find the most frank recognition of the fact one class of property interests was in conflict with another. This recognition appears not so much in attacks on opponents as in appeals to the groups which have the most at stake in the outcome of the struggle, although virulent abuse of debtors and paper money advocates is quite common. Merchants, moneylenders, public creditors are constantly urged to support the Constitution on the ground that their economic security depends on the establishment of the new national government." End quote.
Yeah, it's. I mean, they say the quiet part out loud. It's. This isn't really debatable or controversial. This is what was said at the time, and these were the forces in play.
Yes. Now I have a comically tiny block of text on screen. Would anyone other than me want to read from the last paragraph on page 293 so I don't have to shout into my microphone up until the beginning of 295 if you have the text?
What
Yeah.
293 would be the screenshot? Oh, you can take it if you already have it.
Hold on, I don't have, but I can get it up one sec.
Cool, yeah, because yeah, this has become really difficult, and if I read all of this, I will I'm gonna really regret it.
What page?
So this is starting at 3, a profound division.
What page?
Yes, a profound vision.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just start reading here. A profound division ensued throughout the United States based on different views of the rights of property. At length, continues Marshall, 2 great parties were formed in every state which were distinctly marked and which pursued distinct objects with systematic arrangement. The one struggled with unabated zeal for the exact observance of public and private engagements. By those belonging to it, the faith of a nation or of a private man was deemed a sacred pledge, the violation of which was equally forbidden by the principles of moral justice and of sound policy. The distresses of individuals were, they thought, to be alleviated only by industry and frugality, not by a relaxation of the laws or by a sacrifice of the rights of others. They were consequently the uniform friends of a regular administration of justice and of a vigorous course of taxation which would enable the state to comply with its engagements. By a natural association of ideas, they were also, with very few exceptions, in favor of enlarging the powers of the federal government. The other party marked out for themselves a more indulgent course. Viewing with extreme tenderness the case of the debtor, their efforts were unceasingly directed to his relief. To exact a faithful compliance with contracts was, in their opinion, a harsh measure which the people would not bear. they were uniformly in favor of relaxing the administration of justice, of affording facilities for the repayment of debts, or of suspending their collection, and of remitting taxes. The same course of opinion led them to resist every attempt to transfer from their own hands into those of Congress powers which by others were deemed essential to the preservation of the Union. In many of these states, the party last mentioned constituted a decided majority of the people, and in all of them it was very powerful. The emission of paper money, the delay of legal proceedings, and the suspension of the collection of taxes were the fruits of their rule, wherever they were completely predominant. Throughout the Union, a contest between these parties was periodically revived, and the public mind was perpetually agitated with hopes and fears of subjects, which essentially affected the fortunes of a considerable proportion of society.
What the hell? I love the Constitution now.
I mean, yeah, there's...
Well, no, I mean, seriously, this is a very important point, both historically and philosophically, because the argument being advanced here is that property rights are prior to the state, that the majority doesn't have the right to abrogate the property rights of the minority, which is, a very classically American attitude as it has become. Seems like it might have been less so back in the time, and this is where it was firmed up and established as part of the American character. But this is a critical component of the American character, this deep respect for property rights that is encoded here in the Constitution, and which, to my American ears, forms the most compelling argument for the Constitution.
Right, it's the side that like I for instance am most partial towards. I just can't help but notice, though, a very sort of usurious underpinning, perhaps, of the constitutional side that a strict reading of, say, the Old Testament wouldn't jive with. But with that being said, the arguments put forth, and as you can see in the excerpt, the policies, the proliferation of paper money, which, at least as it's been implemented in our life, or in our last few generations, has completely hollowed out this independent middle class of settlers and independent farmers. Like it's everything that was bundled up in that second group, despite the fact it might have been against usury, as some of the trads would point out. Everything that they're advocating for just completely destroys a working civilization within a few decades.
Yeah, I wanted that brought up particularly because there is a point here to the pro-Constitution side, and yes, it is a usurious point, but there is the idea, especially because there were earlier points talking about the sanctity of contracts and compacts. Well, the public debt is one thing, but there are other debts that may exist between parties that are expected to be paid fairly, and the security of that personality, that financial property, if we want to put it that way, is an understandable argument from a moral perspective. And it was interesting because that bit from Chief Justice Marshall, later Chief Justice, obviously, it was a somewhat compelling counterpoint compared to what we've seen before. And I've pulled up on screen the next point that Beard brings to the fore, also citing Marshall again. Mr. Quinn, you wanted to reference this one, so if you would like to read the quote.
Yes, certainly. So, context: John Marshall, the author of both of the columns of text in front of us, was the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, but he was also a historian, and so he wrote both a work of history on the life of General Washington, and he wrote various Supreme Court opinions grounded in the Constitution as it was ratified. And there's a bit of a difference between what Marshall says in one context and what Marshall says in the other context. So in the text on the right, this is from a court case. So this is Justice Marshall, the judge, writing. And he writes, "The government of the United States proceeds directly from the people. It is ordained and established in the name of the people, and it is declared to be ordained in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and secure the blessings of liberty to themselves and their posterity. The government of the Union, then, whatever may be the influence upon this fact on this case, is emphatically and truly a government of the people. In form and in substance, it emanates from them. Its powers are granted by them and are to be exercised directly on them for their benefit. It is the government of all. Its powers are delegated by all. It represents all, and it acts for all. That is Judge Marshall writing. Now we will listen to historian Marshall writing. So balanced were the parties, in some of them, the states, that even after the subject had been discussed for a considerable time, the fate of the Constitution could scarcely be conjectured, and was so small in many instances was the majority in its favor as to afford strong ground for the opinion that, had the influence of character been removed, the intrinsic merits of the instrument would not have secured its adoption. Indeed, it is scarcely to be doubted that in some of the adopting states, a majority of the people were in opposition. In all of them, the numerous amendments which were proposed demonstrate the reluctance with which the new government was accepted, and that a dread of dismemberment, not an approbation of the system under consideration, had induced acquiescences in North Carolina and Rhode Island. Did not in it. North Carolina and Rhode Island did not at first accept the Constitution, and New York was apparently dragged into it by a repugnance to being excluded from the Confederacy. So, two very different pictures of the Constitution, its adoption, and its legitimacy between historian Marshall and Judge Marshall.
Very good. I don't have anything particular to add there. So if that's all we have, I'll move on to page 312. Let's see, I'll pull it up real quick. I wanted to briefly reference these Sentinel letters. I'll quote real quick, quote, "The author of the famous Sentinel letters saw in the movement favorable to the new Constitution a design of the wealthy and ambitious who in every community think they have a right to lord it over their fellow creatures. In fact, the most philosophic argument against the adoption of the new system on account of its intrinsic nature was made by the author of these letters." End quote. So that's sort of framing the perspective here. And then really quickly, last thing I have, quote, "In opposition to the Adams-Madison theory of balanced economic interests and innocuous legislatures, which was the essence of the Federalist doctrine, Sentinel expounded his reasons for believing that distinct property groups should not be set against one another in government, and that trusts in the political capacity of the broad and differentiated mass of the community should be the basis of the Constitution, but it should be noted that his undifferentiated mass was composed largely of property holders." End quote. And he goes on to describe how the Sentinel letters talk about how, property should basically be more or less equally distributed, which is kind of weird. I think the point here is actually sort of in favor of Adams-Madison if you take their perspective as the point of the Constitution is actually to assist in balancing an imbalance that exists. It's sort of akin to the balancing theory of government we talked about a stream or two ago, where, these different interests have to be balanced against one another. Perhaps you might call them estates, you might call them classes, whatever. They need to be balanced for the system to actually be stable. And I think this actually sort of makes another argument for the Constitution, at least at a, philosophical level. I don't know if either of you two have anything to add there, but that's the last thing I had. Do we have any? Oh no, the conclusion. There it is. Yes, I forgot to bring up the conclusion. So I did screenshot it. So who would like to read the conclusion? It's very short. I thought it would be worth just excerpting the last 2 pages, where he lays out all of his concluding thoughts on the research that was conducted.
I can take it if you like.
Very well.
All right. At the close of this long and arid survey, partaking of the nature of a catalog, it seems worthwhile to bring together the important conclusions for political science which the data presented appear to warrant. The movement for the Constitution of the United States was originated and carried through principally by 4 groups of personality interests which had been adversely affected under the Articles of Confederation: money, public securities, manufactures, and trade and shipping. The first firm step towards the formation of the Constitution were taken by a small and active group of men immediately interested through their personal possessions in the outcome of their labors. No popular vote was taken, directly or indirectly, on the proposition to call the convention which drafted the Constitution. A large, propertyless mass was, under the prevailing suffrage qualifications, excluded at the outset from participation through representatives in the work of framing the Constitution. The members of the Philadelphia Convention, which drafted the Constitution, were, with few exceptions, immediately, directly, and personally interested in and derived economic advantages from the establishment of the new system. The Constitution was essentially an economic document based upon the concept that the fundamental private rights of property are anterior to government and morally beyond the reach of popular majorities. The major portion of the members of the convention are on record as recognizing the claim of property to a special and defensive position in the Constitution. In the ratification of the Constitution, about 3/4 of the adult males failed to vote on the question, having abstained from the elections at which delegates to the state conventions were chosen, either on account of their indifference or their disenfranchisement by property qualifications. The Constitution was ratified by a vote of probably not more than 1/6 of adult males. It is questionable whether a majority of the voters participating in the elections for the state conventions in New York, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Virginia, and South Carolina actually approved the ratification of the Constitution. The leaders who supported the Constitution in the ratifying conventions represented the same economic groups as the members of the Philadelphia Convention, and in a large number of instances, they were also directly and personally interested in the outcome of their efforts. In the ratification, it became manifest that the line of cleavage for and against the Constitution was between substantial personality interests on the one hand and small farming and debtor interests on the other. The Constitution was not created by the whole people, as the jurists have said. Neither was it created by the states, as Southern nullifiers long contended, but it was the work of a consolidated group whose interests knew no state boundaries and who were truly national in their scope.
Excellent. Thank you very much for reading that for me. And I think, I think Beard really says everything there is to say in terms of the economic analysis. It's demonstrated resoundingly in the book, the fact that the Constitution is, in fact, an economic document. It is not a document of the whole people or even of the states. It's a document built on the particular economic, that is to say, class interests of a group of elites, aristocrats, whatever you want to call them, property holders, real estate holders, financial instrument holders who existed at the time. And that is really the source of the Constitution. It is not some sort of sacred element that has some perpetual utility. It was created to be utilized by a particular group at the time they needed this particular national function to exist in a particular way that had taxation power and the power to regulate commerce, and also the state legislatures, which, of course, was done by the new branch, the Supreme Court, right? This idea that the states would now be regulated, this occurred through the Supreme Court very quickly. This was a major problem with that state legislatures could make laws that these property holders viewed as disrespecting their property rights, so to speak. So that's really all I have to conclude with. Do you either of you have any other additional closing thoughts to add before we get to super chats?
The coda I would add to that is, for all that the Constitution is the particular product of particular interests at a particular time, it has nonetheless impressed its shape upon the American character for the intervening 230 odd years. It is important to understand our origins as Americans, and it is equally important to understand our development through history as Americans, for we are not now where we started, and we will not finish where we are now. And so it is important to understand things like the history of the Constitution, the economic impact thereon, because it's part of the story of what makes Americans American. It is the story of who is an American. This is a big component.
Indeed. So with that, I'll finish up the super chats. We mentioned Christopher Burks earlier for $2 and a salute. Dawn Browning says sends us 50 Australian dollars with a microphone emoji. Yes, indeed, I'll probably be buying a new microphone now. I suppose next week I'll just default to my laptop mic, and we might need a different producer on the stream, depending on how that works, because I don't feel like shouting next stream, that's for sure. I might see if I can take the knob. I think the gain knob on this Yeti may have broken and it is stuck low, so we'll see. But I hate this microphone anyway. Never buy a Yeti Blue, please. I've been using it for a decade now, unfortunately. Son of Hester for $5, president of the new Ivy League, New Hampshire mentioned, listening live as I have the night off for once. Thank you for your hard work, gents. Shout, Charlie, shout. Yes, well, fortunately, my voice is not wrecked since you two did some reading for me here. But yeah, this has been quite uncomfortable. And then James S. for $10. Thank you for the interesting discussion, gentlemen. Thank you for your donation. Very good donations tonight. Very much appreciated. And yes, next week we will be looking at The Betrayal of the American Right by Murray Rothbard with Pete Quinones, and of course, special guest Tom Woods, if all goes well. So really looking forward to that. And yeah, I think that's going to be a really good stream. I don't know about you two.
Very excited.
Yeah, this is going to be one of my favorites for a long time, so looking forward to it.
For sure. Okay, so thanks everybody for listening in despite Tucker Carlson dropping his latest interesting interview literally right before this. But if you watch live, thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.